I'm taking everything. That's how he started. No warning, no build-up, no hesitation, just those 3 words spoken like he was discussing something ordinary, something already decided. For a second, I thought I had misheard him because that sentence didn't belong in a marriage that had lasted 40 years. But then he said it again, slower this time, like he wanted to make sure I understood it clearly. The house, the car, the savings, I'm taking all of it. His voice didn't shake, didn't rise, didn't carry anger or emotion. It was calm in a way that felt wrong for the moment, like he had already said these words somewhere else before bringing them here to me. And that was the first thing I noticed, not the words themselves, but the way they came out. Smooth, measured, rehearsed. Hello there, my dear. I'm truly glad you stopped by. Welcome to Voice of Granny June, a little corner where I share the kind of stories that only time and life can teach. Stories shaped by love, family, mistakes, forgiveness, and the lessons we gather along the way. Now, let's go back to where we left off. We were standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had spent most of my adult life building something I believed belonged to both of us. The light above the sink cast that soft yellow glow across the counter, and he was leaning slightly against it like this was just another evening conversation. Nothing in the room had changed, and yet everything suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was standing inside a version of my life that no longer included me. I watched his face carefully, searching for something I recognized, some trace of hesitation or discomfort, but there was nothing there. Not anger, not guilt, not even regret. Just a quiet certainty, like he had already walked through this moment in his mind and was now simply delivering the final version out loud. Then he started listing things again, slower this time, almost like he was reading from memory. The house, the car, the accounts. Each word landed with precision, too clean, too organized to belong to a spontaneous decision. This wasn't someone thinking out loud. This was someone repeating something he had already decided, already structured, already prepared. And that's when the realization began to form, not all at once, but quietly, piece by piece. This conversation wasn't happening for the first time, not for him. I was the only one hearing it for the first time. He had already been here before, already walked through these words, already decided what this moment would look like long before stepping into the kitchen with me. For a moment, I didn't say anything, because something inside me was adjusting to a truth I hadn't expected to face. 40 years of shared life, shared decisions, shared routines that I believed meant something solid, something mutual. And yet here he was, speaking as if those years had no weight in what he was about to take. I looked at him carefully, not with disbelief, but with a kind of quiet focus, trying to understand what I had missed. Because suddenly it felt like there had been something happening beneath the surface for a long time, something I hadn't seen, something I hadn't questioned. I've already spoken to someone, he added, almost casually, like that detail didn't matter. Everything is being handled. That was the moment everything became clear in a different way. Those weren't the words of a man making a decision. Those were the words of a man finishing one. The kind of words that come after conversations, after arrangements, after steps have already been taken. I felt my hand rest against the counter, steady, controlled, but my mind was no longer focused on what he was saying. It was focused on what he had already done, on how far this had gone without me knowing, on how long this had been happening without me being part of it. So I asked him one thing. Since when? I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't ask why. I asked the only question that mattered. And for the first time since he started speaking, there was a pause, small, almost invisible, but I saw it. A slight shift in his expression, just enough to tell me that the answer existed, even if he didn't want to give it. Then he looked at me again, calm as before, and shrugged lightly. It doesn't matter, but it did. Because in that moment, I understood something that didn't come with anger or tears or even shock. It came with clarity. This didn't start today. It didn't start this week. It didn't start when he walked into the kitchen and said he was taking everything. It started long before that, in decisions I wasn't part of, in conversations I never heard, in plans that had been built carefully while I was still living inside a version of our life that no longer existed. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't tell him he was wrong. Instead, I just nodded once because there was nothing left to debate. He watched me, maybe expecting a reaction, maybe waiting for something to confirm that I understood what was happening. But when I didn't give him anything, when I simply stood there without breaking, something in his expression shifted slightly. Not concern, not regret, just a brief flicker of uncertainty, like he wasn't entirely sure what my silence meant. And that's when I smiled, not because I was okay, not because I accepted what he said, but because in that moment I understood something he didn't. He thought this was the moment he took everything from me. He thought this was where I realized I had nothing left. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't the beginning of the loss. It was the moment I finally understood how long he had already been planning it. For 40 years, I believed I knew the man who stood in that kitchen and told me he was taking everything. I believed I understood the life we had built together, the quiet structure of it, the routines, the decisions, the sense that everything between us was shared in a way that didn't need to be questioned. And maybe that was the problem. Because standing there that night, listening to him speak with that calm, rehearsed certainty, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. It wasn't just that I didn't recognize the man in front of me. It was that I had trusted a version of him I had never fully examined. A version that now felt incomplete in ways I couldn't ignore anymore. Ours was the kind of marriage people describe as stable, the kind that doesn't attract attention because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. We didn't have loud arguments or moments that forced us to question everything. Instead, we had consistency, shared habits, years that blended together in a way that made everything feel dependable. I trusted him the way you trust someone after enough time has passed that doubt feels unnecessary. He handled certain parts of our life, I handled others, and over time that separation became something we never discussed. It simply existed quietly, comfortably, like a system that had proven itself enough times to be left alone. He always took care of the finances. It started naturally back when we were younger and trying to build something from nothing. He seemed more comfortable with numbers, more interested in the details of savings, accounts, long-term planning, and I didn't question it. I focused on everything else, on the home, on the routines that made our life feel complete, and together it felt balanced. At least that's what I believed. He would occasionally mention investments or decisions he had made, explaining them in a calm, confident way that made everything sound secure. I would listen, nod, and move on, never feeling the need to ask for more detail. Because trust, once it settles in, doesn't feel like something that needs constant checking. There was one moment, years ago, that came back to me later in a way it hadn't at the time. I remember walking past his office while he was going through a stack of documents, the door half closed, the light inside dimmer than usual. I had asked him something simple, something unrelated, and he had answered quickly without looking up, his hand moving just slightly to shift the papers out of view. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't suspicious in any clear way. but I remember pausing for half a second longer than necessary before walking away. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, just paperwork, just timing, just a moment that didn't need meaning. And like everything else, I let it pass. Looking back now, I understand how easily trust becomes automatic. The longer something appears stable, the less likely you are to question it, even when small details don't quite fit. There were no dramatic warning signs, no single moment that clearly said something was wrong. Instead, there were small things, quiet things, things that didn't demand attention and therefore never received it. His calm explanations, his control over certain parts of our life, the way everything seemed handled before I ever thought to ask about it. None of it felt urgent enough to examine. And over time, that lack of urgency became its own kind of blindness. But now, standing in that kitchen, listening to him calmly explain how he was taking everything, I saw it differently. Not as separate moments, not as harmless habits, but as pieces of something larger I had never put together before. The calmness in his voice wasn't new. The certainty wasn't new. The control wasn't new. What was new was my ability to see it clearly without the comfort of trust softening the edges. And the more I thought about it, the more one realization settled into place with a quiet, undeniable weight. I hadn't just trusted him. I had trusted him enough not to look, and that meant there were parts of our life I had never actually seen at all. The cracks didn't start the night he stood in the kitchen and told me he was taking everything. They had been there long before that. Quiet, subtle, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for them, and I wasn't looking. Because when you've lived beside someone for 40 years, you don't expect something beneath the surface to shift without you noticing. You assume that whatever changes happen, they'll happen in a way you can recognize. But that only works when the change isn't meant to stay hidden. At first, it was small things. So small they didn't feel worth holding onto. He started coming home a little later than usual, not dramatically late, just enough to shift the rhythm of our evenings. When I asked, he gave simple answers that sounded reasonable. Extra work, a meeting that ran long, someone needed help. And I accepted it not because I examined his answers carefully, but because I had no reason to doubt them. Trust doesn't demand proof after decades. It simply accepts what it's given. And so I accepted it again and again without noticing how those small changes were slowly becoming consistent. Then the conversations began to change. Not in a way that was obvious, but in a way that stayed with me longer than it should have. His answers became shorter, more controlled, like he was choosing exactly how much to say and no more. Not nervous, not defensive, just measured. I remember asking him once about a letter I had seen on his desk earlier that day, something official looking that I didn't recognize. He didn't hesitate when he answered, but he didn't expand either. Just routine paperwork, he said, already shifting the conversation before I could follow up. It wasn't the answer that stayed with me. It was how quickly the door on that question closed. There was also a shift in the way he moved through the house, something subtle but impossible to unsee once I noticed it. Doors that used to stay open were now closed more often. His office especially became a space I stopped entering without realizing when that change had happened. One afternoon, I walked in without thinking while he was sitting at his desk, and for a brief second, something in him reacted. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. A quick adjustment. A slight movement of his hand like he was covering something or turning something away. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm expression he always wore. He smiled, asked if I needed anything, and the moment disappeared as if it had never happened. But later, I found myself thinking about it longer than I expected to. None of these moments meant anything on their own. That's what made them easy to dismiss. The later evenings, the shorter answers, the closed doors, each one had an explanation that made sense if you didn't look too closely. And I didn't. Because the idea that something was being hidden from me didn't fit into the life I believed we had built. So instead of questioning it, I did what I had always done. I trusted that everything was fine. There was one evening, though, that stayed with me in a way the others didn't. We were sitting in the living room, the television on, but neither of us really watching it, when his phone buzzed on the table beside him. He glanced at it quickly, just for a second, before turning it face down without saying anything. That wasn't unusual. People do that all the time. But what caught my attention was the expression that crossed his face in that brief moment before it disappeared. Something small, something I couldn't name at the time. I almost asked who it was. The question reached the surface, clear and simple. But then I stopped myself. Not because I didn't care, but because asking would have made the moment real. And something in me wasn't ready for that yet. Now, looking back, I can see those moments clearly, not as separate events, but as pieces of something I wasn't meant to understand all at once. They weren't random. They weren't harmless. They were the beginning of something that had already started without me. At the time, they felt like small cracks, barely visible, easy to ignore if you weren't looking directly at them. But cracks don't stay small. And by the time I finally saw them for what they were, it was already too late to stop what had been set in motion. I went into his office that afternoon for something simple. A document we had both used before, something routine, the kind of thing I had reached for countless times without thinking. But the second I opened the drawer, I knew something was different. Not in a way that would alarm anyone else, just enough to make me pause. The folders were arranged differently, labeled in a way I didn't recognize, organized with a kind of precision that felt unfamiliar. And for the first time in years, I didn't close the drawer and move on. I stayed. I told myself I was only looking for what I needed, that I wasn't searching, that I wasn't questioning anything. But my hands slowed and my eyes moved more carefully than they ever had before. And that's when I saw it. A folder that didn't belong to anything I recognized. It wasn't hidden. It was placed neatly among the others like it had always been there. But it hadn't. His name was on it, not mine, along with an account I had never heard him mention in 40 years of marriage. I hesitated for just a moment before opening it, not out of guilt, but because something in me already understood that whatever was inside would not fit into the life I thought I knew. The papers were clear. That was the part that unsettled me the most. There was no confusion, no attempt to hide behind complexity. Statements, balances, transfers, everything laid out in a way that made it easy to follow if you took the time to read them. And I did, slowly, carefully, enough to understand what I was looking at. Accounts I had never seen, money that had never been discussed, movements that had happened quietly without conversation, without explanation, not all at once, but steadily, intentionally. I sat there with the folder open in my hands, feeling something shift inside me. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet, steady realization settling into place. Because this wasn't something I could explain away with a simple question. This wasn't recent. This wasn't accidental. This was something that had existed without me for longer than I could immediately trace. And what unsettled me most wasn't the money itself. It was the fact that I had never thought to look for it. For 40 years, I believed what we had built was shared, not just emotionally, but practically. That our life, the house, the accounts, the decisions existed between us, not behind one of us. And yet here I was, holding proof that parts of that life had been quietly separated, moved into places I didn't even know existed. And suddenly, everything else began to align. The shorter conversations, the closed doors, the careful answers. They weren't random changes. They were part of something that had already been in motion. I closed the folder slowly, not because I didn't want to see more, but because I already understood enough. This wasn't a single decision. It wasn't something that had just begun. It had been built over time in controlled, deliberate steps, each one small enough to go unnoticed. And in that moment, I realized something else, something even more important than what I had just discovered. If I asked him about it now, I wouldn't get the truth. I would get the version of it he was prepared to give me, so I didn't ask. I put everything back exactly the way I had found it. The folder, the papers, the drawer. Every detail returned to its place as if I had never been there at all. And when I walked out of that room, I carried something with me that I hadn't had before. Not proof, not yet, but awareness. Clear, quiet, and impossible to ignore. Because now I understood something I couldn't unsee. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't coincidence. This was planning. And whatever he was preparing, he had been preparing it without me for a very long time. What I had seen in that folder didn't leave me uncertain. It clarified something. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but with a quiet certainty that settled deeper the longer I sat with it. Because once you understand that something has been happening without you, carefully, deliberately, you stop looking for isolated details. You start seeing the shape of it instead, the pattern behind it. And as I moved through the house that evening, nothing looked different, but everything felt rearranged in a way I couldn't ignore. Not physically, not visibly, but structurally. As if the life I thought we were living had already been adjusted, piece by piece, into something I hadn't been included in. It showed itself in small, practical ways. The kind of things I had always overlooked because they never seemed important enough to question. Documents I no longer recognized. Mail that no longer arrived where it used to. Conversations about finances that had quietly disappeared, not with conflict, but with absence. And that absence was what unsettled me the most, because nothing had been taken away suddenly. Nothing had been forced. It had simply faded until there was nothing left to notice unless you were looking for it. And now I started paying attention in a different way, not outwardly, not in a way that would change how I behaved around him, but internally, quietly observing the way you do when you're trying to understand something that doesn't want to be seen too clearly. And the more I paid attention, the more everything aligned with what I had already begun to suspect. What I had found in that drawer wasn't a single discovery. It was one part of something larger, something already in motion long before I became aware of it. This hadn't been put together quickly. It had been built. That was the difference. This wasn't reaction. This wasn't adjustment. This was structure. And structure requires time, intention, and a level of certainty that doesn't come from impulse. I remember one moment that made that truth impossible to ignore. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where he would later stand and tell me he was taking everything, and he was going through a stack of papers. It was an ordinary scene, familiar. Something I had seen countless times over the years. But this time I didn't look away. I watched. The way he moved through the pages, the order, the precision, there was no hesitation in him. no uncertainty. Just a quiet, practiced rhythm like this wasn't something he was figuring out. It was something he already knew. At one point, he shifted a document slightly away from me, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention. Just enough for me to notice, enough for me to understand. And in that small, controlled movement, something inside me settled completely. Because that wasn't instinct. That wasn't accidental. That was awareness. He knew exactly what he was doing, and more importantly, he knew exactly what he didn't want me to see. I didn't ask what he was working on. I didn't lean closer or try to read what had been moved out of view. Because by then, I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. The truth wasn't going to come from what he told me. It was already written in what he had been doing, and it was becoming clear. He hadn't just been managing our life, he had been restructuring it. Quietly, completely, without me. The realization didn't hit all at once. It settled into place piece by piece until there was no space left to doubt it. Every detail I had ignored before now connected to something larger. The closed office door, the shortened conversations, the accounts I didn't know existed, the information that no longer reached me, none of it stood alone anymore. It formed something complete, a plan, and the most unsettling part wasn't that he had made it. It was that he had been living inside it while I was still living inside something that no longer existed. I went to bed that night beside him the same way I had for decades. The same room, the same quiet routine, but there was something final in the way the silence felt. Not empty, not tense, just decided. Because lying there in the dark, I understood something I hadn't been willing to say out loud before. This wasn't something that could be undone. This wasn't something I could fix. And whatever place he had made for me in the life he was building, it was already smaller than I had ever imagined, and no longer mine to choose. He didn't choose a dramatic moment to say it. There was no argument, no raised voices, no tension building toward it. That was the part that stayed with me later, the calmness of it. The way something so final could be delivered so casually, as if it had already been decided long before the words were spoken. It happened in the same kitchen, under the same light, in the same quiet space where we had spent years talking about ordinary things. And maybe that's why it felt the way it did. Not like a moment that changed everything, but like the confirmation of something that had already been set in motion. "I'm taking everything," he said it plainly. No hesitation, no emotion. Just a statement delivered in the same tone he might have used to comment on the weather or remind me of something routine. And for a brief second, the words didn't fully register, not because I didn't hear them, but because of how easily he said them. Like they weren't meant to shock me, like they weren't meant to start a conversation. They were simply meant to be accepted. Then he continued. The house, the car, the accounts. He listed them one by one, not rushing, not stumbling, just moving through them with a quiet certainty that made it clear this wasn't something he was figuring out in the moment. He had already done that part. This was just the delivery. And as he spoke, I watched him, not the words, not the list, but him, the way he stood, the way his shoulders remained relaxed. The way his eyes didn't search for a reaction. There was no anticipation in him, no concern. Just a calm expectation that this would go exactly the way he believed it would. That I would listen, that I would accept it, that I would have no place in what came next. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't question what he was saying. I just stood there, letting the words settle into the space between us. Not because I agreed with him, but because I realized something in that moment that changed the way I heard everything he said. He believed this was already finished. Not the conversation, not the moment, the outcome. That's why there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty in his tone. Because to him, this wasn't a decision being made, it was a result being delivered. And suddenly, everything I had seen before, the folder, the accounts, the quiet changes, came into focus in a way that made his confidence make sense. He wasn't asking, he wasn't negotiating, he was informing me. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he added, almost as an afterthought, like it was just another detail that supported what he had already said. "Everything's in place. Everything's in place." That was the moment the weight of it settled differently. Not heavier, clearer, because those 4 words confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This hadn't just been planned, it had been completed, structured, organized, finalized without me. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. And for the first time since he started speaking, something shifted slightly in his expression. Not doubt, not concern. Just a small release, like a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding had finally eased. Relief. He thought I understood. He thought I accepted it. He thought I had no response. And in that moment, I realized something else. He hadn't been preparing for a conversation. He had been preparing for silence, for compliance, for an ending that would happen exactly the way he had arranged it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him how long he had been planning this, even though that question sat clearly in my mind. Because by then, I already knew the answer mattered less than the fact that it had been happening without me at all. So I did the one thing he expected. I stayed calm. I let him finish. I let the silence sit exactly the way he believed it would. And I smiled. Not because I agreed with him, not because I didn't understand what he was saying, but because in that moment I saw something he didn't. He believed he had already won. He believed everything was in place. He believed there was nothing left for me to do. And that belief, was the first mistake he had made since this plan began. He thought my silence meant the end. That was the part he misunderstood. Because for 40 years, I had been quiet in ways that made things easier. I had stepped back when it made sense. I had trusted when it felt right. I had allowed him to lead in areas he seemed more comfortable handling. But that kind of silence, the kind that comes from trust, is very different from the kind that comes from understanding. And what he saw that night, standing in that kitchen while I listened without interrupting, wasn't the silence he thought it was. It was the kind that comes before action. I didn't confront him after that. I didn't ask questions or challenge what he had said. I moved through the next few days exactly the way I always had. Calm, predictable, unchanged on the surface. I made coffee in the morning. I spoke to him the same way I always did. I didn't bring up the conversation again, and neither did he. And I could feel it, the quiet certainty in him growing stronger with each passing day. The way he moved more freely through the house. The way his tone carried a kind of finality, as if everything had already been settled. And that was exactly what I needed him to believe. Because while he thought nothing had changed, everything had. I started with the simplest things first. Not dramatic actions, not anything that would draw attention, just small, deliberate steps. The kind that could easily be overlooked if you weren't paying attention. I began going through documents I had never taken the time to understand before. Not quickly, not all at once, just enough each day to build a clearer picture of what had been done and what still could be. I didn't remove anything. I didn't rearrange anything. I learned, quietly, carefully, patiently. I made calls when I was alone, keeping my voice steady, my questions simple. not revealing too much, not asking anything that would raise concern if it were overheard, just enough to understand where things stood legally, what had been moved, what hadn't, what could still be challenged, and what couldn't. Some of the answers confirmed what I already suspected. Some of them didn't, and those were the ones I paid the closest attention to because they showed me something important. His plan wasn't perfect. It was structured, thought through, carefully built over time, but it wasn't complete. There were details he had assumed I would never question, gaps he believed I would never notice. And those gaps were where everything began to shift. I didn't act on them immediately. That would have been too obvious, too fast. Instead, I let time pass the way he expected it to. I allowed him to settle deeper into his belief that everything was already decided, that I had accepted my place in what he had arranged, that there was nothing left for me to do. And the more comfortable he became, the more room I had to move. I remember one afternoon sitting at the same kitchen table where he had listed everything he intended to take, looking at a single piece of paper that most people wouldn't have thought twice about. It didn't look important, it didn't stand out, but I understood something about it that he didn't. He had focused on control, ownership, access, but he had overlooked something smaller, something procedural. And sometimes it's the smallest details that matter the most. I didn't rush, I didn't hesitate. I simply did what needed to be done, one step at a time, quietly, without announcement, without confrontation. Because this was never going to be won in a conversation. It was never going to be resolved in that kitchen under that light with words spoken out loud. This had been built in silence, and that's where it would begin to come apart. He didn't notice anything different, not the calls, not the documents, not the small shifts happening around him, because I hadn't changed anything he could see, and that was the point. By the time he realized something was different, it would already be too late to stop it. Because while he believed he had already won, I had just begun. The change didn't happen all at once. That was the part he never expected. He believed if anything shifted, it would be obvious. Loud, confrontational, something he could see, respond to, control. But that's not how it began. It started quietly in ways that didn't announce themselves. Small adjustments, subtle differences, nothing dramatic enough to question, but enough to exist. And because he wasn't looking for change, because he believed everything was already settled, he didn't notice when the ground beneath him began to move. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't confront him or challenge what he had put in place. I continued exactly as I had in the days before, calm, steady, predictable. I made sure nothing about my behavior suggested anything had shifted. And that allowed something else to happen. It allowed him to relax completely into his assumption that there was nothing left to manage, that he had already finished. And that belief created space. The first real shift came through something so small it would have seemed meaningless to anyone else. A form, a signature, a procedural detail that had been overlooked not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't appear to be. It was the kind of thing that sits quietly in the background of larger decisions, unnoticed unless someone takes the time to understand how everything connects. And I had taken that time. I didn't act dramatically. I didn't move quickly. I simply followed the structure that was already there carefully, correctly, in a way that didn't disrupt anything on the surface. But underneath that surface, something began to realign, not completely, not visibly, but enough to matter. I remember the first moment I saw the effect of it. Not in a conversation, not in anything he said, but in something he didn't expect to happen. A hesitation, Small, brief, almost unnoticeable if you weren't paying attention. He was going through his usual routine, moving through documents with that same quiet certainty he had carried for weeks. And then, for just a second, he paused. Not long, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. The plan he had built was beginning to shift, not collapse, not fail, just move slightly out of alignment. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't question it out loud. But I could see the change in the way he approached things after that. A little more careful, a little more aware, not concerned yet, but no longer completely certain. And that was all it took, because certainty is what had made his plan work. And now that certainty had a fracture in it. I continued exactly the same way. No sudden changes, no visible action, just quiet movement beneath the surface, following the same pattern he had used: structured, patient, deliberate. Because I understood something he hadn't considered. Plans don't unravel all at once. They shift first. They weaken in places you don't expect. And if you don't recognize those shifts early enough, you don't see the outcome changing until it already has. There was another moment a few days later that made it even clearer. He was on the phone, speaking in that same controlled tone I had grown used to hearing, discussing something I couldn't fully make out. But I heard one word. Adjustment. It was brief, almost lost in the rest of the conversation. But it didn't belong there, not in the way he had been speaking before, because his plan hadn't required adjustments. It had required execution. And hearing that word told me everything I needed to know. Something wasn't lining up the way he expected anymore. I didn't react. I didn't acknowledge it. I simply continued, step by step, letting the process unfold the way it needed to. Because by then, I understood something important. This wasn't about stopping what he had built. It was about shifting it, just enough, just quietly enough, that by the time he realized what had changed, he wouldn't be able to put it back the way it was. He still believed he was in control. He still believed everything was moving according to the plan he had designed. But control isn't something you lose all at once. It slips, gradually, silently, until one day you reach for it and realize it isn't where you left it. And he was closer to that moment than he understood. By the time he realized something had changed, it was already too late to stop it. And that was the part he never saw coming. There was no argument building toward it, no raised voices, no moment that would have warned him to slow down or reconsider what he had already set in motion. The shift didn't arrive with noise or confrontation. It arrived quietly, just like everything else had, structured and precise, already in place before he became aware of it. The difference this time was simple, but it changed everything between us. He felt it. Not completely, not all at once, but enough to interrupt the certainty he had been carrying since the beginning. And for the first time since he stood in that kitchen and told me he was taking everything, that pause didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to him. He came back into the house that afternoon moving differently, not in a way anyone else would notice. But I had spent 40 years watching him closely enough to recognize even the smallest shift in his behavior. His steps were still measured, his posture still controlled, but something underneath had changed in a way he couldn't fully hide. The ease was gone. The quiet confidence that had carried him through every decision, every movement, every conversation no longer held the same steady weight. He moved through his routine the way he always did, picking up papers, adjusting things on the table, opening drawers, but his attention lingered longer than it should have, as if something no longer aligned the way he expected it to. And that hesitation told me more than anything he could have said out loud. The confirmation came later in the form of a letter, and this time it didn't allow him the comfort of ignoring it or reshaping it into something smaller. The envelope was official, unmistakably legal, the kind that carries authority without needing explanation, the kind that doesn't arrive unless something has already shifted beyond personal control. I saw it in his hand before he opened it, and what stood out wasn't the paper itself, but the way he held it. He didn't move immediately the way he always had. He paused just slightly, as if something inside him already understood that whatever was written inside would not match the outcome he had already decided. When he finally opened it, his movements were slower than usual, more careful, not controlled in the way I was used to seeing, but cautious in a way that didn't belong to certainty. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time, and then he stopped completely, holding the paper still in his hands without adjusting it, without turning it, without continuing, as if reading it again wouldn't change what it meant. And in that moment, I understood something clearly without needing to see a single word written on that page. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't something that required time to process or explain. This was a denial. Not of timing, not of process, but of authority, of access, of something he believed had already been secured entirely in his favor. I asked him what it was, my voice calm, steady, exactly the same as it had been since the day he told me he was taking everything. And for the first time in all of this, he didn't answer right away. That silence mattered more than anything he could have said, because he always had an answer, always had control over how things were explained, adjusted, or redirected. Until now. When he finally spoke, he called it a clarification, but the way he said it didn't carry the weight of truth. It carried the weight of something being reduced, something serious being made smaller so it could feel manageable again. But we both understood that wasn't what it was. It wasn't clarification. It was interruption. Something had been flagged. Something had been blocked. Something that no longer moved forward with his approval alone. He folded the paper too quickly, not with the same precision I had watched him use for years, but with a slight imbalance that revealed more than he intended. And in that small moment, I didn't need to see the contents to understand the outcome. The structure he had built so carefully had shifted, not collapsed, not disappeared, but moved just enough that it no longer belonged entirely to him. The next morning, I heard him on the phone, and even without hearing every word, I understood exactly what had changed. His tone was still measured, still controlled, but now there was something else layered into it, something that hadn't been there before. Adjustment, correction. He wasn't executing anymore. He was responding, asking questions, rechecking decisions, trying to realign something that had already moved beyond the control he thought he had secured. And that difference was everything, because once you begin responding, you are no longer deciding the outcome. You are reacting to it. I remained exactly as I had been, calm, quiet, unchanged, because this was no longer about what I needed to say or reveal. The shift had already happened. The plan he believed was complete was now moving without him, shaped by something he hadn't fully accounted for. And that something wasn't loud, wasn't obvious, wasn't confrontational. It was structural. It was procedural. It was the kind of change that doesn't remove what exists, but quietly alters how it can be used, how it can be controlled, and who it truly belongs to. For the first time since this began, the certainty that had carried him forward was gone, and in its place was something unfamiliar to him. Doubt. Not dramatic, not spoken, but present in every pause, every adjustment, every movement that no longer carried the same effortless control. Because the truth doesn't need to be explained when it becomes real. It only needs to exist in a way that cannot be undone. And now it did. In a letter he couldn't ignore, in a plan that no longer held its shape, and in a silence that no longer worked in his favor. Because the moment he realized something had changed was the moment everything he thought he controlled stopped belonging to him. In the end, he did take things, and that was never really in question because everything he had prepared, everything he had structured over time, was designed to make that outcome look clean and complete from the outside. The house, at least on paper, carried his name the way he had arranged it. The car followed the same path, and the accounts he had quietly separated over the years reflected the control he believed he had secured long before I understood what he was doing. If someone had looked only at the surface, they would have believed he succeeded exactly as he intended, that after 40 years he had reduced a shared life into a list of assets and claimed them without resistance. And for a while, he believed that too. But what he didn't understand, what he never accounted for, was that control is not defined by what you take. It is defined by what you are actually able to use, move, and keep without interruption. And that was where everything began to shift in ways he couldn't correct. Because while the structure he created still existed and the documents still carried his name, the function of those things had changed in ways he didn't expect. He could list the house, but moving forward required delays, approvals, and processes that no longer followed the path he had planned. He could point to the accounts, but access was no longer as simple or as complete as he believed it would be. Something small had changed, something procedural, something he never thought would matter, and now it was shaping everything. What he still owned on paper no longer moved the way he intended in reality. I saw it in the way he moved after that, not in anything obvious, but in the quiet friction that began to exist where certainty used to be. Conversations took longer. Decisions didn't settle as quickly. He paused in places he never used to pause. Not confusion, not failure, but resistance. And plans like his aren't built to handle resistance because resistance creates space, and space is where control begins to weaken. He never said it out loud, never admitted that something had shifted beyond him, but I didn't need him to. I could see it in the way his confidence no longer moved in a straight line, in the way he checked things more than once, in the way he adjusted instead of assumed. And that was enough to understand that what he believed he had secured was no longer entirely his to control. And by then, something else had already become clear to me. He had spent years preparing to take everything that could be measured, everything that could be listed, signed, and transferred. But he had never once considered what existed outside of that system. He couldn't take the awareness I gained the moment I opened that drawer. He couldn't take the understanding that came from finally seeing the pattern behind his behavior. And he couldn't take the control I found when I stopped reacting to him and started moving in ways he didn't see. Because by the time he stood in that kitchen and told me I would be left with nothing, I was no longer standing where he thought I was. I had already stepped outside of the version of the life he believed he was dismantling. Not physically. Not in a way he could measure, but in a way that mattered far more than anything he had written down or planned. He thought this was about ownership, about assets, about control. But what he took existed only on paper. And what he couldn't take was the only thing that ever truly belonged to me. Before you go, my dear, let me say this. If you stayed with me until the very end, then this story meant something to you. And that tells me you weren't just watching, you were listening with your heart. If it touched you in any way, please take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and your words mean more to me than you know. This little space we have here is more than just stories. It's a place where we share the lessons life teaches us quietly, and there are many more waiting to be told. So if you'd like to sit with me again, make sure you subscribe and stay close. I would truly love to have you here for the next story. Until then, take gentle care of yourself, and I'll be right here when you come back.